Okay, so for my SMART goals, I am going to be looking at students' ability to formulate a thesis statement. So in this presentation, I'm going to discuss the context of the classroom that I'm analyzing, and then I employed this learning goal within, and then I'm going to give an explanation of the assessment, starting with the baseline assessment and why I chose that, and then how I crafted my SMART goal after analyzing that baseline data. And then I'll do a review of the mid-assessment and post-assessment data. I'll look at some student examples, student work. I'll look at some of the overall weaknesses, and then I will reflect a little bit on my goals, where they met, and how I would move forward in the future. So the context of my classroom, it's a 9th grade honors world history 1, so up to 1500, and geography. There's 23 students ages 14 to 15. I have 1 student with an IEP, 2 with 504 plans, and 3 minority students. My classroom is primarily white students, so 87% of the students are white. It's mixed evenly between female and male. Most of them come from upper middle class families with 2-parent households, and actually 57% of my students have parents that are employed by a higher education institution or a state university. Another thing that I would like to note is the fact that this is an honors class. So before I even entered the classroom, there was a large emphasis on writing due to the fact that that is something that is used heavily within AP courses, and this honors course is seen as a pre-AP course. So that is something that my CT and then I continue to focus on. It is something that is very important for students moving on. So before I even got into the class, they had already been assigned a semester-long research paper. The research paper had been broken down into segments. They had created their own due dates. The first thing that was due was an annotated bibliography, then a rough draft, and then lastly a final draft. They had been taught how to research, where to find sources, how to analyze primary and secondary sources for information. And so I wanted to find a way to tie in my SMART goal to not only help with their writing skills, but help them craft or get started on writing their actual research paper. I believe that a good introduction and a thesis statement can really be a great basis for, what the rest of your paper is going to be like. So I thought that that was a good start. So my first assessment that I gave them, you'll see here on the screen, I posted a announcement in Google Classroom after announcing it to them in class. I do have honors kids, so they got a bit anxious when I assigned this with very minimal guidelines. They like to know exactly what they're supposed to do, how it's supposed to be done. So this provided some anxiety for them. So I said that they were simply to write a first draft of an introductory paragraph to their research paper. I reminded them that I'm not giving them specific guidelines on purpose because I want to create a baseline and really see what their approach was to writing. Previously, before this goal, I had not observed any of their writing other than maybe some small exit tickets that they had done in informative assessments, so very informal writing. I urged that this was not graded, and I really didn't want them to stress. I just wanted them to put forth their best effort, and I wanted them to know that we would work from there. So the data that you'll see here is the data from the baseline assessment. Not really surprisingly, you'll see that 65% of my students scored in the unacceptable range, which was a 0 to 40. So the scale that I used had a possible of 10 points, and then I just converted that into percentage. So 15 students out of my 23 scored unacceptable, which is a 40% or below. 6 of my students, which is 26%, scored needs improvement, which is anywhere from a 50 to a 60%. 2 of my students scored a 70 to an 80%, which is proficient. And then none of my students scored exemplary. So what this really tells me is that they haven't really been introduced to the basics or the elements of a thesis statement. Many of them, there was no indication of them trying to even write a thesis statement. So that being said, I wanted to base my goal on writing a thesis statement and helping them grow in that area. So my SMART goal, based on the baseline data, was that by the end of the semester, 100% of my second block students will make measurable progress in their thesis writing skills by writing a concise thesis statement. By the end of the semester, students will be able to write a thesis statement with a clear and concise claim, researchable supporting evidence, formal and appropriate wording, and one that outlines the organization of a paper. So those are the main components that the rubric will then grade them on. And then furthermore, 75% of my students will score at least 70% or higher on their thesis writing. So I want all of my students to make some sort of progress, and then I want at least 75% of my students to score in the proficient range, which would be from 70 to 100. So the rubric that you'll see here is what I graded them on. So this would be more the exemplary range. So they would get a high of 2 points, or if it wasn't met, it would be 0. So I looked for their claim and the uniqueness of their subtopics or the presence of supporting evidence. I wanted to know that their subtopics were supportive to their claim and researchable. And then I wanted to know that there was an effectiveness to their thesis statement, so it made readers want to continue to read. Word choice was something I wanted to hone in on. I noticed a huge issue, the use of first and second person, the use of contractions, the use of qualifiers. So instead of being experts in their field, as they're stating this claim, they're writing this research paper, they should act as experts. They did a lot of might, maybe, perhaps, probably, I think, and I wanted to steer away from that and focus more on formal writing. And then, of course, spelling and grammar, and making sure that their statements are concise and to the point, but powerful at the same time, so not too long and not too short. So you'll see here my mid-assessment data. I employed strategies such as doing a mini lesson, providing checklists that they could use to self-reflect. I gave examples of a good thesis statement, a bad thesis statement. I provided lecture slides online as well for them to refer back to as needed. And so we'll see growth here for sure. So now only 35% of my students scored in the unacceptable range. So overall, every growth did take place. Out of the 8 students that scored unacceptable, 3 who scored unacceptable didn't turn anything in at all. And then the 5 students that remained, 3 of them showed growth and 2 of them stayed the same. So there still was growth there, even though they still were in unacceptable range. And the students, 7 students scored in the proficient area. 6 students scored in the needs improvement, and then 2 students scored in the exemplary. So we got an improvement there as well. Right. So I didn't mention, but for the mid-assessment, the prompt was basically the same. I just had, after giving very in-depth individual feedback on each of their first baseline assessments, I had them, for the mid-assessment, revisit that same introductory paragraph and revise it and rewrite it according to the lessons that I had given and the feedback that I have given. And then because the research paper was canceled for the semester, they had a lack of interest in doing anything relating to that. So I kept the same criteria as far as how I was grading their thesis statements, but I did it based on their project that they had been working on recently, which was an autopsy project on the fall of empires. So I had them use the research they had found within that project to write a thesis statement describing or claiming, what was the main reason that empires fall. So in this, you'll see that 14% of students, or 14 students and 61% of students continued to show growth for their mid-assessment to post-assessment, and 9 of those students that didn't show growth, and out of the 9 that didn't show growth, 8 of them stayed the same, and 1 student didn't turn in a mid or a post, so that's where you'll see that extra student. This 1 student missed a lot of school, and they regularly did not pay attention. So that wasn't a surprising issue. Only 2 students scored unacceptable by the end. However, they did show improvement from their baseline assessment. So overall, 22 students out of 23, so 96%, showed growth from their first baseline assessment. So although I didn't meet my 100% of students making progress because of that 1 student who didn't turn in a mid or post, I really would call that a victory as far as students making progress. Furthermore, my SMART goal dictated that 75% of students would score at least 70% or higher. While I didn't meet that goal either, I'm pretty proud of the fact that 65% of my students scored proficient or higher, so 75% or higher. And as I said, all students but 1 student showed at least some progress. So here is one example. This is a student that likes to joke around, and he did not take his first draft seriously. As you can see, eating tree stuff, unless someone shows up with a hammer. They're highlighted because I had made comments on his feedback. So he received a 10% or a 1 out of 10 on this first one. But you can see that he really did apply himself to an extent on the mid-assessment. You'll see here is the second one. And he actually improved his score from a 1% or 10% to a 60%. And then his post-assessment, you'll see he scored a 70%, so he got into that proficient range. But you'll see much more formal wording here. You'll see that he does make a claim, although it's not as declarative or concise as it could be. He does make a claim, although I urged him to expand on how disease affects a civilization and why that leads to the decline of empires. So some common issues that I saw within the thesis statements overall, and even, nearing the end, some of the things that people got points off for was